Imagine lying wounded in the snow, bleeding across your back, enemy fire tearing up the earth around you, and knowing that if you do not move forward alone, more than 100 of your brothers will die in the next hour. Now imagine rising to your feet anyway. On January 8, 1945, one American sergeant did exactly that, not once but 3 times, destroying 3 fortified German machine gun positions by himself while critically wounded, saving an entire company from annihilation. This is not fiction. This is not exaggeration. This is the true story of what one man can do when courage becomes the only option left. If you appreciate stories of real American heroes, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. And down in the comments, let us know what city, state, or country you are watching from. Now, let me take you to that frozen hillside in France, where a wounded soldier became a legend. The Vosges Mountains in January of 1945 were a place where men went to die slowly. The pine forests that blanketed the slopes had been shattered by months of artillery fire, leaving jagged stumps and splintered trunks that jutted from the snow like broken teeth. The cold was not the clean, bracing cold of a winter morning back home. It was the kind of cold that crept into your bones through wet boots and soaked uniforms, the kind that made your fingers too stiff to pull a trigger, the kind that turned shallow wounds into life-threatening infections. The snow was deep, sometimes waist-deep in the draws and gullies, and it had a crust on top that would hold your weight for 2 steps before collapsing and plunging you down into the soft powder beneath. Every movement was exhausting. Every breath came out as a white cloud that hung in the frozen air and gave away your position. Technical Sergeant Russell Eugene Dunham of East Carondelet, Illinois, knew this landscape well by January of 1945. He was 24 years old, but he looked older. The men who fought in the Vosges all looked older. Dunham was not a large man, not the type you would pick out of a crowd as a warrior. He stood about 5 feet 9 inches tall, with a lean, wiry build that came from years of hard work and months of infantry combat. His face was narrow, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that had seen more death than any 24-year-old should ever witness. He had grown up during the Great Depression in a small town along the Mississippi River, where his father worked in a lead smelter, and his mother raised 5 children on whatever money was left over. Dunham had learned early that life did not hand you anything for free, that you worked for what you got, and that complaining never changed a damn thing. He had enlisted in the United States Army in 1942, shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, like thousands of other young men who felt the pull of duty stronger than the pull of safety. He had trained at camps across the American South, learning how to march, how to shoot, how to dig a foxhole, how to follow orders, and how to lead men when the officers were dead or wounded. By the time he shipped overseas with the 45th Infantry Division, he had been promoted to Technical Sergeant, a rank that carried real responsibility. He was in charge of other men's lives now, and that weight settled on him like a rucksack full of stones. The 45th Infantry Division, known as the Thunderbirds, had seen brutal combat across Sicily, Italy, and southern France. They had landed at Anzio and fought through the hell of the breakout. They had stormed ashore in Operation Dragoon and pushed north through the Rhone Valley, fighting the Germans every step of the way. By the winter of 1945, they were deep in the Vosges Mountains near the town of Kaysersberg, a medieval Alsatian town that sat in a valley surrounded by steep, forested hills. The Germans held the high ground. They always seemed to hold the high ground, and from those heights, they could rain down machine gun fire and mortar shells on any American unit that tried to advance. Dunham's unit, part of the 157th Infantry Regiment, had been ordered to take a series of hills that overlooked Kaysersberg. The objective was simple on a map: advance up the slopes, clear the enemy positions, secure the high ground. But nothing was simple in the Vosges. The Germans had spent months fortifying these hills. They had dug machine gun nests into the frozen earth, reinforced them with logs and sandbags, and positioned them to cover every possible approach. They had pre-sighted their mortars and artillery on the likely avenues of advance, so that the moment American soldiers stepped into the open, they could bring down a storm of high-explosive shells. And they had the advantage of elevation, which meant they could see you long before you could see them. On the morning of January 8, 1945, Dunham and his platoon were ordered to assault a hill that the men had started calling Hill 16. It was not an official designation, just a number someone had scrawled on a map, but it stuck. Hill 16 was a long, gradually sloping rise covered in deep snow and scattered with the stumps of trees that had been cut down or blown apart. At the top of the hill, the Germans had established 3 machine gun positions in a triangular formation, each one supporting the others with interlocking fields of fire. The guns were MG-42s, the weapons the Americans called Hitler's buzzsaw because of the terrifyingly fast ripping sound they made when they fired. An MG-42 could spit out 1,200 rounds per minute, and in the hands of a trained crew, it could cut a man in half at 300 yards. Dunham's platoon started up the hill just after dawn. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy with clouds that promised more snow. The men moved in a loose skirmish line, spacing themselves out to avoid giving the Germans a concentrated target. They wore white mattress covers and sheets over their uniforms for camouflage, trying to blend into the snow, but it was never quite enough. You could still see the dark shapes of their helmets, the barrels of their rifles, the clouds of breath that puffed out with every labored step. They made it about halfway up the hill before the first machine gun opened fire. The sound was instantaneous and overwhelming, a long tearing burst that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Snow exploded in white geysers all around the advancing Americans. Men dropped flat, hugging the ground, trying to dig themselves into the snow with their fingers. Some of them did not drop fast enough. Dunham heard the wet, heavy sounds of bullets hitting flesh, heard the screams of men who had been hit, heard the desperate shouts of soldiers calling for medics. Within seconds, the entire advance had stalled. The platoon was pinned down in the open, completely exposed, with no cover except the shallow depressions they could scrape in the snow with their helmets and entrenching tools. Dunham pressed himself flat against the frozen ground and tried to assess the situation. It was bad, worse than bad. The machine gun fire was coming from at least 2 positions, maybe 3, and it was sweeping back and forth across the slope in overlapping arcs. Anyone who tried to move forward would be cut down immediately. Anyone who tried to retreat would be shot in the back. The Germans had them exactly where they wanted them, trapped on the open hillside with nowhere to go. Dunham could hear the platoon leader, a young lieutenant whose name he would never forget, shouting orders, trying to organize a response. But the words were lost in the noise of gunfire and exploding mortar shells. The Germans had called in mortar support now, and the rounds were starting to fall among the pinned-down Americans, throwing up fountains of snow and frozen earth, sending shrapnel whining through the air. Dunham knew what would happen if they stayed where they were. The mortars would find their range, the machine guns would keep firing, and within an hour, everyone on that hillside would be dead or wounded. There was no artillery support available, no tanks, no air cover because of the weather. They were on their own. He looked around at the men nearest to him, young soldiers from farms and small towns all across America, boys who had trusted him to keep them alive, and he realized that no one was coming to save them. If something was going to change, he would have to change it himself. He began to crawl forward, It was not a decision born of courage, not in the way people imagine courage. It was born of necessity, of the simple understanding that staying still meant death and that someone had to do something. Dunham had no illusions about being a hero. He was terrified. His heart was hammering in his chest so hard he thought it might burst. His hands were shaking. But he had learned a long time ago that fear was just a feeling, and feelings did not have to control your actions. You could be afraid and still move. You could be afraid and still fight. He had pulled a white mattress cover over his uniform and helmet, trying to blend into the snow. He had loaded himself down with every grenade he could carry, stuffing them into his pockets, his belt, anywhere he could fit them. He had extra bandoliers of ammunition slung across his chest. He carried his M1 Garand rifle, the standard infantry weapon of the United States Army, a semi-automatic rifle that fired 8 rounds from an internal clip. It was a good weapon, reliable and accurate, and Dunham had long since learned to trust it with his life. The crawl up the hill was the longest journey of his life. The snow was deep and wet, soaking through his uniform, chilling him to the core. He moved in tiny increments, dragging himself forward on his elbows and knees, keeping his body as flat as possible. The machine gun fire continued to sweep across the hillside above him, the bullets cracking through the air just feet overhead. He could hear them, sharp and deadly, and he knew that if he raised his head even a few inches, he would be killed instantly. He moved during the pauses between bursts, timing his advances to the rhythm of the guns. Crawl 3 feet, stop, wait, listen, crawl again. He could feel the cold seeping into his body, numbing his fingers and toes, making his muscles ache. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, and each exhale created a small cloud of steam that he worried the Germans might see. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him, looking for obstacles, looking for any tiny bit of cover, a fallen log, a stump, a depression in the snow. The slope seemed to go on forever, stretching upward into the gray sky, and with every yard he gained, the machine gun fire seemed to grow louder and closer. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, Dunham reached a point where he could see the first machine gun nest. It was dug into the hillside about 30 yards ahead of him, a low, camouflage position reinforced with logs and sandbags. He could see the barrel of the MG-42 protruding from the firing slit, could see the muzzle flashes as the gun fired, could even see the shadowy shapes of the German soldiers inside. There were at least 3 of them, maybe 4, working the gun, feeding the ammunition belts, scanning the hillside for targets. Dunham lay still in the snow, watching, calculating. 30 yards, too far for a grenade throw, especially uphill. He would have to get closer, much closer. He began to crawl again, moving even more slowly now, knowing that he was within easy rifle range of the Germans, that if they spotted him, he was dead. The snow crunched softly under his weight. His breathing sounded impossibly loud in his own ears. He was certain they would hear him, certain they would see him, but he kept moving. 20 yards, 15, 10. At 10 yards, he stopped. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely pull a grenade from his belt. He wrapped his fingers around the cold metal, feeling the weight of it, feeling the grooves of the pineapple casing. He pulled the pin, held the spoon down, took a deep breath and threw. The grenade arced through the air and landed directly inside the machine gun nest. The explosion was deafening, a sharp crack followed by a shower of dirt, snow, and debris. Dunham heard screams from inside the position, heard the clattering of equipment, heard someone shouting in German. He did not wait. He was already on his feet, running forward, rifle up, firing as he moved. The surviving Germans were scrambling, disoriented by the blast, trying to bring their weapons to bear. Dunham shot one of them as he emerged from the smoke, shot another as he tried to swing a rifle toward him. He reached the edge of the position and threw a second grenade, then dove to the side as it exploded. And then something hit him. It felt like being struck across the back with a baseball bat swung by a giant. The impact drove him forward and down, slamming him into the snow. For a moment, he could not breathe, could not think, could not understand what had happened. Then the pain arrived, a white-hot burning sensation that spread across his entire back and down his left side. He had been hit by machine gun fire from one of the other German positions, the bullets tearing through his uniform and into his flesh. He could feel the wetness of blood soaking into his clothing, could feel the heat of it against his skin, even in the freezing cold. He tried to get up and found that his legs would not respond properly. He managed to get to his hands and knees, gasping for air, tasting blood in his mouth. The world was spinning. His vision was blurred. He heard a metallic clink next to him and turned his head to see a German stick grenade lying in the snow less than 3 feet away, the fuse already burning. Instinct took over. He lashed out with his boot and kicked the grenade away, sending it tumbling down the hill. It exploded halfway down the slope, the blast wave washing over him but causing no additional damage. He collapsed again, face down in the snow, struggling to stay conscious. Every breath was agony. He could feel himself growing weaker, could feel the cold creeping deeper into his body, could feel the darkness closing in at the edges of his vision. But he could also hear the second machine gun still firing, still raking the hillside, still killing his men. He thought about the soldiers down below, pinned and helpless, waiting to die. He thought about the families back home who would receive telegrams, the mothers and fathers and wives who would be told that their sons and husbands had been killed in action on some God-forsaken hill in France that they could not even pronounce. He thought about the lieutenant who had trusted him, the boys in his platoon who looked to him for leadership. And he realized that if he quit now, if he let himself die in the snow, all of those men would die too. So he got up. It should not have been possible. The pain was beyond description. The blood loss was severe. His body was in shock, shutting down, conserving energy for vital functions. But Russell Dunham forced himself to his feet anyway, swaying, barely able to stand, and he started moving toward the second machine gun nest. He could not run anymore. He could barely walk. He moved in a stumbling, weaving gait, clutching his rifle in hands that were slick with blood. The Germans in the second position saw him coming and opened fire, but he was moving erratically, unpredictably, and their shots went wide. He was close now, close enough to see the faces of the men inside the nest, close enough to see the fear in their eyes as they realized that this lone American soldier, this wounded, bleeding man who should have been dead, was still coming. He pulled another grenade, armed it, and threw it with the last of his strength. The throw was weak, wobbly, but it was enough. The grenade landed at the edge of the position and rolled inside. The explosion silenced the gun. Dunham followed up with rifle fire, methodically shooting at anything that moved, expending round after round until his clip pinged out and he had to reload. His fingers fumbled with the fresh clip, slippery with blood, but he got it loaded and kept firing. The second machine gun was destroyed. But there was still a third. The third position was higher up the hill, the dominant point in the German defensive line. From there, the machine gun crew had a clear field of fire over the entire slope and into the valley beyond. It was the strongest position, the most heavily fortified, and it was still pouring fire down on the American soldiers below. Dunham could see tracer rounds arcing through the air, see snow kicking up all across the hillside, hear the screams of wounded men. He started climbing again. He did not remember much of that final approach. The pain and blood loss had pushed him into a strange, distant state where his body seemed to be operating on autopilot. He crawled, he stumbled, He fell and got up again. He was moving through a nightmare landscape where everything was white and gray and red, where the sound of gunfire was constant and overwhelming, where every breath was a struggle. He left a trail of blood in the snow behind him, a dark red line that marked his progress up the hill. The Germans in the third position were firing at him now, concentrating their fire on this single stubborn target who refused to die. Bullets kicked up snow all around him, whined off rocks, snapped through the air so close he could feel the pressure waves. He pressed himself flat and crawled, timing his movements between bursts, waiting for the brief pauses when the gunner had to reload or traverse to a different target. Crawl, stop, wait, crawl, stop, wait. He reached a point about 15 yards from the position and knew he could not get any closer. His body was failing. He could barely lift his arms. His vision was fading in and out, going dark at the edges. He had maybe one more grenade throw left in him, maybe one more effort before he collapsed for good. He gathered every last bit of strength he had, every ounce of will, every fragment of determination. He thought about his mother and father back in Illinois, about his brothers and sisters, about the girl he had left behind, about all the things he wanted to do if he survived this war. He thought about the men on the hillside who were counting on him, and then he stopped thinking and just acted. He rose to his knees, pulled his last grenade, armed it, and threw it with everything he had left. The grenade sailed through the air in a perfect arc and dropped directly into the machine gun nest. The explosion was massive, larger than the previous ones, and Dunham realized that the grenade must have set off stored ammunition inside the position. Secondary explosions followed, bright flashes and sharp cracks as German grenades and ammunition cooked off in the fire. The machine gun went silent. The hillside went silent. And then, incredibly, he heard American voices shouting, heard the sound of men advancing, heard the crunch of boots in snow as his platoon rose from cover and pushed forward. Dunham tried to stand but could not. He collapsed into the snow and lay there, staring up at the gray sky, feeling the cold seeping into him, feeling his heartbeat slowing. He had done it. Somehow, impossibly, he had done it. He had destroyed 3 fortified machine gun positions by himself while critically wounded. He had broken the German defensive line. He had saved his platoon. Medics reached him a few minutes later, scrambling up the hill with their aid bags. They rolled him over gently, cut away his uniform to expose the wounds, and began working to stop the bleeding. There were multiple gunshot wounds across his back and side, ugly, ragged holes where the bullets had torn through flesh and muscle. He had lost a tremendous amount of blood. His skin was pale and cold, his pulse weak and thready. The medics gave him morphine for the pain, wrapped him in blankets, and prepared to evacuate him down the hill. But Dunham refused to go. He insisted, through gritted teeth and waves of pain, that he was staying with his men. The medics argued with him, told him he would die if he did not get to a field hospital, but he would not listen. He had started this fight with his platoon, and he was going to finish it with them. So they bandaged him as best they could, gave him more morphine, and left him propped against a tree stump while they moved on to treat other wounded soldiers. Dunham remained with his unit for the rest of the day, refusing evacuation even as his condition worsened. It was not until nightfall, when he finally lost consciousness from blood loss and shock, that the medics were able to carry him off the hill. They loaded him onto a stretcher and hauled him down through the snow to an aid station, then transferred him to a field hospital farther back from the lines. The doctors there operated on him immediately, removing bullet fragments, repairing damaged tissue, transfusing blood to replace what he had lost. It was a near thing. He came very close to dying on the operating table, his heart stopping twice before the surgeons were able to stabilize him. But Russell Dunham was tougher than anyone had given him credit for, tougher maybe than he had given himself credit for. He survived the surgery, survived the infections that followed, survived the long, painful weeks of recovery. The doctors told him he would be going home, that his war was over, that he had done more than enough. But as soon as he was able to walk again, as soon as he could hold a rifle without collapsing, he demanded to be sent back to his unit. And they let him go. He rejoined the 157th Infantry Regiment in time to participate in the final push into Germany. He was there when the 45th Infantry Division helped liberate the Dachau concentration camp, where he witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was there when Germany finally surrendered in May of 1945, ending the war in Europe. On the afternoon of his assault on Hill 16, military investigators had interviewed the survivors of Dunham's platoon and pieced together what had happened. They counted the bodies of 9 German soldiers killed in the 3 machine gun nests, found 7 more wounded Germans who had been captured, and took 2 prisoners who had surrendered after the 3rd position was destroyed. They estimated that Dunham had fired approximately 175 rounds of rifle ammunition and thrown 11 grenades during his lone assault. Most importantly, they determined that his actions had saved the lives of approximately 120 American soldiers who would have been killed or wounded if the German positions had not been neutralized. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was submitted immediately and moved quickly through the chain of command. On June 8, 1945, exactly 5 months after his assault on Hill 16, Technical Sergeant Russell Eugene Dunham was awarded the Medal of Honor by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch at a ceremony in Nuremberg, Germany. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism, his complete disregard for his own safety, and his determination to accomplish his mission despite severe wounds. Dunham stood at attention as the medal was placed around his neck, his back still aching from the wounds, his eyes still haunted by everything he had seen. He did not feel like a hero. He never would. When reporters asked him about his actions, he gave short, clipped answers, deflecting attention away from himself and toward the other soldiers who had fought on that hillside. He said he had just done his job, that anyone in his position would have done the same, that the real heroes were the ones who had not come home. It was not false modesty. He genuinely believed it. In his mind, he had simply been a soldier following orders, trying to keep his men alive, doing what needed to be done. Russell Dunham returned to the United States in the autumn of 1945, along with millions of other veterans who were trying to figure out how to live in a world without war. He went back to East Carondelet, back to the small house on the banks of the Mississippi River, back to his family and the girl he had left behind. He married, had children, found work at a manufacturing plant. He spent decades working ordinary jobs, living an ordinary life, rarely speaking about his experiences in the war. But he never forgot the men he had served with, and he never stopped trying to help his fellow veterans. He became active in veterans organizations, working to ensure that soldiers coming home from Korea and Vietnam and later wars received the support and benefits they had earned. He visited schools and talked to students about duty and sacrifice, though he always downplayed his own role. He attended reunions of the 45th Infantry Division, traveling across the country to see old friends, to share memories with the men who understood what they had been through together. As the years passed and the number of World War II veterans dwindled, Dunham became a living connection to a generation that was slowly disappearing. He was invited to ceremonies and commemorations, asked to speak at Memorial Day events, honored by grateful communities who wanted to thank him while they still could. He accepted these honors with quiet dignity, always redirecting praise toward others, always emphasizing that he had been part of something larger than himself. Russell Eugene Dunham died on April 10, 2009, at the age of 89. He passed away in his home in Illinois, surrounded by his family, having lived a full life that spanned nearly 9 decades. His funeral was attended by veterans from multiple wars, by family and friends, by people who had never met him but who wanted to pay their respects to a man who embodied the best of what America asks of its soldiers. He was buried with full military honors, and the Medal of Honor that he had worn around his neck on that June day in Nuremberg was placed in a case and given to his family. The story of what happened on Hill 16 on January 8, 1945, is not widely known today. It does not appear in most history books about World War II. There are no major movies about Russell Dunham, no television documentaries, no monuments erected in his honor. He would have preferred it that way. He never sought fame or recognition. He simply did what he believed was right, in a moment when the cost of inaction was measured in the lives of his brothers in arms. But the story deserves to be remembered, not because it glorifies war, but because it reveals something essential about the human capacity for courage in the face of impossible odds. Russell Dunham was not a superhero. He was not invincible. He was a young man from a small town who found himself in a situation where all the options were terrible, and the only choice was between dying uselessly or dying while trying to save others. And in that moment, when his body was screaming at him to quit, when every rational thought told him that advancing alone against 3 machine gun nests was suicide, he chose to move forward anyway. He did it while wounded, bleeding, in excruciating pain, and terrified. He did it knowing that the odds of survival were almost zero. He did it because more than 100 of his fellow soldiers were depending on him, because someone had to do something, because the alternative was unthinkable. And through a combination of skill, determination, and what can only be described as sheer force of will, he succeeded. That is the kind of courage that does not make headlines, the kind that happens in frozen forests and on bloody hillsides far from home, witnessed only by the men who were there and the enemies who fell before it. It is the courage of ordinary people who do extraordinary things when called upon, not because they are special or different, but because they refuse to let their brothers die without a fight. The 120 American soldiers who walked off Hill 16 that day, who went home to their families after the war, who lived full lives and raised children and grew old in peace, owed their survival to the actions of one wounded technical sergeant who would not quit. Some of them knew it. Some of them spent the rest of their lives grateful to a man they barely knew. Others never learned the full story, never understood how close they had come to dying on that snowy slope, never realized that a single act of almost suicidal courage had saved them. Russell Dunham never asked for their thanks. He never needed it. He had done what he had set out to do. He had kept his men alive. In the end, for a soldier, that was enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the sacrifices made by men and women in uniform throughout our history, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Stories like Russell Dunham's deserve to be told and retold, passed down from generation to generation, so that we never forget what was given on our behalf. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought of this story. How would you have reacted in Dunham's position? What does courage mean to you? And let us know what city, state, or country you are watching from, so we can see how far around the world this story of one soldier's determination has traveled. Thank you for watching, and remember those who served.